Just to begin, I'm here to welcome everyone. I'm Jay Varelis, and here at the LPE project, I'm the project lead of the Anti-Monopoly and Regulated Industries Academy. Some of you may have attended our summer academy last summer, and we are now planning to do a follow-up second summer academy this coming summer. So be on the lookout for more information about that. I'm also a PhD student in political science at UC Berkeley, and I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Law and Political Economy, which just launched last fall. Thank you for joining us today for this event. As you know, we had hoped to gather in person last spring for the LPE Democracy Beyond Neoliberalism conference. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible. And while we were disappointed that we weren't able to all gather in person and as a community, we are very happy to be hosting our reconstructed virtual conference series. And that's thanks to the generosity, patience, and hard work of all of you and everyone in our community. So thank you very much. On our website, which is lpeproject.org, you can find our entire lineup of events for the virtual conference and more events. In addition to that, you can also find registration links and previews of upcoming blog symposia on the LPE blog. There you can also sign up for conference-specific updates and reminders. So be sure to check out the website. It's always more stuff is being added there. Before we get started today, I'll just note that our next event in the virtual conference series will be this coming Thursday from 2:30 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic of social movements and the political. And the panelists for that discussion will be William Forbath, Brian Kettering, Connie Raza, John Whitlow, and Lucy White. And so you can sign up on the website if you're not signed up already. Back to today, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Sonoy Das. Sonoy is a SJD candidate at Harvard Law School and a member of the Harvard LPE chapter. Sonoy's current research focuses on international trade and the history of capitalism. So he's a very relevant person to lead us today. Finally, thanks to Ava Liu from the Harvard Law School LPE chapter for live tweeting the event from the LPE project account today. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll hand it off to Sonoy.
All right, thank you, Jay, and welcome to everybody. We have an exciting panel for you today. Joining our conversations is the theme of money, power, and markets. I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists and then turn it over to them each for 12 minutes at the beginning. I'll be keeping time and letting you know when your time is up. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion amongst the panelists, and I might ask a couple of questions then. And then we have a half an hour for everybody else to ask questions and for the panelists to respond to that. Please use the Q&A function to start typing your questions as and when you have them. You can also upvote each other's questions, and that sort of pushes the question up the queue for me to call on that question. So we'll start with very brief introduction to the panelists. Speaking first today, we have Paula Ahumada, who is an assistant professor at Universidad de Chile. She works in political and constitutional theory with a political economy dimension. We have Roy Kreitner, who is professor of law at Tel Aviv University. He works on legal theory, legal history, and history and theory of money. We have Suresh Naidu, who is professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. His work focuses on economic inequality, economic history, and the economic effects of political change. And finally, we have Tala Said, who teaches at Berkeley. He works with critical approaches to intellectual property, normative legal theory, and the foundations, the theoretical foundations of political economy. We have Paula going first. So I hand it over to you, Paula, for 12 minutes.
Thank you, Sonoy, and hello to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the LPE project for organizing this panel and also everyone attending it. I'm very excited about presenting my work in progress and discussing it with this emerging community of scholars interested in the understanding of the constitutive role of law in modern capitalism, and in doing so, trying to decode, like in Pistor's naming the ways in which the legal system reinforces the current politics of capital accumulation of wealth in market societies. My presentation is part of this work in progress entitled Legalism Under Stress, the Unidad Popular and the Chilean Banking System from 1970 to 1973, where I intend to reassess the politics of money creation and its dynamics, inspired by the emerging legal scholarship regarding money that challenges its orthodox economic conception as a neutral instrument of exchange, by illuminating the role of law for the social and economic order. In this endeavor, I analyzed the experience of the Unidad Popular government as a case study. The tragic ending of this so-called socialist experiment is well known, ending in the September 11th, 1973 coup, but neither its lessons in terms of money governance nor the radical transformation of the epistemological understanding of money after the 1973 coup have been duly examined. The importance of analyzing this Chilean experience of money governance, I think, goes beyond geographical borders, especially because current and our common understanding of money has devalued its connection to political authority, legal order, and the state. This is, of course, revealed, for instance, in the broad defense of central banking independence and its technical rather than political dimension after the 90s. In doing so, I explore the conceptual relations between money and political authority by contrasting two distinctive narratives, which I pose as a framework underpinning monetarism and structuralism. Then I portray Chile's political and economic structure before 1970s to explain the role that money, and especially in particular credit, had for Allende's political project. Then I also describe the government's policy to acquire most of the private banking system using the legal tools in place at the time, and doing so by the first year of government. Finally, I analyze how these changes in money governance spearheaded the constitutional crisis of 1972-1973, which precedes the military coup. So I'd like also to tell you why I'm interested in this topic or why I find it fascinating. First, of course, my aim is getting a better understanding of my own country's recent history and the ideological influences behind our legal system. It is noteworthy that Allende's government is usually remembered for the nationalization of mining and copper through expropriation of foreign, especially US mining companies, following its battle against imperialism and economic dependency, which inspired its political program, and also the intensification of the agrarian reform that intended to change the Chilean social structure based on what is called the latifundio through the expropriation of land. However, its impressive success in achieving the taking over of the banking system during its first year of government is almost forgotten in our collective memory, even when this traumatic experience, especially for the economic elites, I think can partially explain some of the radical constitutional provisions of the 1980 Constitution, which after our past October 11th rebellion is finally under revision. So, and the other interest, of course, is more theoretical. Money has been rediscovered as a topic of legal inquiry following the work of scholars who emphasize its political and always contingent institutional shape. For me, these are exciting developments because they have also broadened the scope of inquiry, moving forward from the study of campaign finance regulations that usually constitutional scholars or the ones who are interested in constitutional theory and the relation with the economic power usually look towards studying and analyzing this topic, and pushing us to the heart of what macroeconomy is about: money, government, and its relation. What are the roles of money and government for our economic life, and how law defines its relation? So out of the two distinctive narratives about money that I developed explaining in the paper, the first one, the orthodox view, followed by classical and neoclassical economists, is grounded on the natural character of money as this universal commodity, and the idea that the commodity notion of money is born out of custom and social conventions and not the state, emphasizes its exchange function over the other functions of money. But this conventional history of money cannot explain for its political significance, because money not only reflects the inequalities of wealth, but especially under current capitalist dynamics, it generates them. So, however, it is a compelling view, I think, since as the narrative focuses on this integrative character as a medium of exchange, it also supports the understanding of market as this spontaneous order, becoming a key building block to understand the infrastructure of our current economic institutions. So, as it is well known under Hayek's influential work, the market is more than a method for organizing the economy or the creation of value. In fact, he insists in distinguishing it from the economy, for it is the paramount institution for warranting a free society. As the market has no defined collective goal, nor can assure the satisfactions of certain needs before certain wants, rather it assumes the needs and wants, the skills and knowledge of everyone participating in it. So, following this reciprocity principle implied in the barter and exchange system, I quote, people are induced to contribute to the needs of others without caring or even knowing about them, using the limited knowledge that each one has provided by this cash nexus which holds the great society together, he says. So, the origin of the monetary order envisioned by the conventional history of money is drawn out of these spontaneous interactions, exchanges between maximizing and rational individuals, following this reciprocity principle, and closely resembles the Hayekian catalaxy. But even when it is the condition of possibility for the extension of markets, under this theory, money plays the role of a mere veil that is presumed to have no effect on the real economic production and distribution that takes place like underneath it. The value of money as a commodity relies on its claimed neutral character, and as the universal commodity for which all of the others can be traded, it has an inherently instrumental character. In Mill's words, quote, there cannot in short be intrinsically a more insignificant thing in the economy of society than money. But this way of framing the origins of money is not only deeply contested in historical terms, but also inaccurately describes how money actually works. It reinforces a fictitious antagonism and separation between the market and the state that prevents a clearer understanding of the monetary and also the political phenomena involved in it. The second narrative of money that locates its origins in a centralized authority that presupposes not equal but unequal social relations is more accurate to describe how money works through the legal order and to explain, for instance, the contested banking policies carried out by the Unidad Popular government. It is worth remembering also that for the Unidad Popular, under its program, they correctly described the monetary question like a purely political question. These heterodox theories help to understand what was at stake, for instance, when the Chilean government decided to change its mode of governance. Banks are not just this neutral intermediary between savings and investments, but determine the level of money creation and, more importantly, decide its allocation. In the case of Chile, the structure of the banking ownership led to credit concentration and had become a specific problem for the economic system. Commercial banks inside corporate structure revealed the problem of capital accumulation because the same people that owned big companies, the productive industries, also were in its banking boards and governing bodies. Credit and debt cycle was therefore controlled by the same private, foreign and national capital. And this concentration of wealth and credit also created an inflationary pressures over the general economy. So then, in order to steer production and development, credit was the key element for changing the economic structure and the monopolistic dynamics involved in it. As President Allende declared, only by putting the banks in the hands of the people it is possible to accomplish a program, and was to become this part of a broader reorganization of the economic system. Not only to recover control over the process of domestic creation of money, but maybe and more importantly, to sever the ties between financial power and monopolistic companies.
Just quickly, you have less than 2 minutes left right now.
Okay, I'm almost done. So money, I think, cannot be neutral because it is enmeshed in social relations of credit and debt, which are backed by the state, essentially comprising this endogenous process. And in practice, it requires a complex set of governance decisions that makes it a legal institution. But if it is acknowledged as a legal relation rather than a commodity, then its value, so its trust in its capacity to perform its functions in the future, will also depend on the legitimacy of the legal authority. Finally, so I follow here Christine Desand's work. I find it very persuasive to understand money as a product of a distinctive mode of governance that, as she has said, like can be structured in ways democratic or dictatorial, and likewise it is susceptible to redesign that changes the way it circulates and the exchange it enables and the exchanges it enables. So that's like the core of my inquiry. I'm particularly interested in the conditions of possibility for redesigning it, having in mind the Chilean partially, I think, successful experience of the 70s. And I'm finished. Thank you.
That was so perfectly on time. It's a wonderful trend setting for the rest of the panel, I think. Thank you, Paula. I turn it over to Roy now.
Thanks. So I'm going to skip a long and really beautifully worked out introduction that is, I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding in the sense that I'm going to skip the introduction because of time considerations, and what that introduction did was try to put the way I'm thinking about money in comparison to some of what's going on in law and political economy, which I think has been fascinating way to sort of take apart the mechanisms that the legal mechanisms that make up capitalism, but the way that work is going is sort of putting out an analytic that works in lots and lots of different places, and eventually trying to think some of the time, at least, about how those different things might be integrated. And the way I'm looking at this is a little more looking at something that I think is the kernel and has just ripple effects. And so this will all be about exactly what Paul was talking about in terms of how money is sort of a special case in the development of today's capitalism, the kind of inequality that it's been breeding over the last, I'd say, 40 years. Now, in the long version of this, I want to look at money sort of internally and externally, and also to show how the internal and the external are related. And if I can convince people of that, of any of those parts, I'll be pretty happy. But for this afternoon, I'll also have to skip the internal part, except to just say that what it tries to show is that the way people try to create money assets or try to create money-like assets is a little bit different from the way they try to make other resources behave like capital. There's when asset holders manage to get their assets to behave like money, when they give them money-like qualities, they actually allow themselves to have an asset to which they have no commitment, because its only feature is that it's actually convertible. It's a little bit different from holding something where you might have any concern about your voice or your loyalty. It's all about exit, and it's a little bit different from a lot of other assets. But I'm going to leave all that aside, and I'm going to skip right to the external story, which is in some ways a little more complicated, and it starts with a detour and then it takes a shortcut. All of this in the interest of time. So the detour is the story of money creation. For simplicity's sake, think about three models. Initially, there's a state and no money, and then the state such as it is, it taxes in kind. So it drafts people for service, war campaigns, road building, whatever you like. And then it has a wonderful idea and announces it will no longer tax in kind, but rather require payment of tokens that it mints for the sake of simplicity, again, out of worthless but unimpeachably identifiable material. So you can call the tokens whatever you want, coins, fiat notes, or just money. Now everyone needs the tokens because the state, as its basic sovereign power, is that it can obligate its citizens. So everybody needs the tokens, and everybody is then, because everybody needs them, everybody's willing to take them from anybody else, and now they circulate. As long as they believe that the state will actually tax. So how does the money get into circulation in the first place? The state simply pays for the services that it wants. So first it pays soldiers, and then it pays provisioners, and then it pays people to pave roads, and at some point maybe it even pays school teachers, and scientists, and so on. And now that there's a resource that everybody needs, it can become the anchor of the price system, and people can specialize in trade. So the state uses its new money, or its anticipatory power to tax, to mobilize an incredible amount of activity. Okay, so that's stage one of this heuristic. Stage two, state thinks all this trade, and all of this is a version of what Paula was saying is the second perspective, right? So stage two, the state thinks all this trade-oriented production is wonderful, but more money would grease the wheels of production and consumption. Everybody would be better off. But the negotiation required for taxing and spending is difficult to manage because everyone has a gripe. There are too many different ideas about where the money should go, not enough ways to generate agreement. So the state decides to outsource. And it grants banks a license to pyramid the money supply on the state money base. Thinks, great, now someone has a profit incentive to pick the winners, to pick winning projects, right, to allocate credit. We'll pick projects that are likely to pay off, and all the while absolving the state from making difficult decisions regarding what to fund. So strikes a deal with the bank, or the banks create money claims, the state accepts those claims as payment, include the equating bank promises with state money, and even agreeing to base its own spending on borrowing rather than printing or creating new money. The bank side of the bargain is that they'll live by a set of regulatory restrictions that impose safety and soundness, or prudential measures that make their inherently fragile business model viable. The banks get a subsidy, sometimes called private seigniorage. Economic activity grows at a rate that was really unseen before the invention. And that's the story of the first financial revolution. After a while, the money generated by the state is a small proportion of the overall money supply. And that, in a compressed nutshell, is where we were, say, until the end of Bretton Woods. Stage three, enter shadow banks, or financial institutions that use the basic model of banking. They borrow short and lend long, but without signing on to the regulatory limitations of traditional banking. To the extent they manage to configure their assets to be money-like, that's the internal part, they enjoy a similar subsidy to that of the banks, but without the regulatory costs. And they expand the functional money supply even more than the banks did vis-a-vis the initial efforts of the state. So, okay, so that's a sort of little detour for background. Now for the shortcut. So imagine the elements of the money supply just mentioned, right? So we have high-powered money, or what I described as state-created. That's the money that the state actually just spends into existence. Then we have bank money. So bank money is created by banks lending, right? Loans create deposits and not the other way around. The banks lend, they create money. And then on top of that, another even larger section is shadow bank money created. These correspond to different elements of funding the activity of society. Now, it's not completely true, that's why it's a shortcut, but we don't have a lot of time, so indulge me for now. In this way, there's a small core of activity that government directly funds into existence, then a large profit-oriented mass of bank-funded activity, where you can imagine that banks actually fund real economy businesses. And then by now, an even larger massive activity funded by shadow banks, which is actually all just floating in the financial markets. Direct government spending is the focus of fiscal policy debate. And how much do we spend on education, how much for defense, how much for infrastructure? Nobody's deceived about its political nature. And for the most part, we imagine that we're funding activities whose purposes are animated by the values that are different from profit. Some of these things correlate precisely with what public finance versions of public goods are, those things that would be underproduced by markets. But that's a deceptive simplification, because the question of what markets can actually supply or can actually supply well is obviously not really a given. And the analytics of what are public goods are not fully developed to actually distinguish between those goods. Bank supplied finance networks works differently. The motivation is profit for the banker, premiums on the secure return. And the same is true for the shadow banker, except that his clients must be much larger. He's not restricted in terms of the risk profile. So the his profit maximization scheme is in many ways the most money-like, because he's never concerned with actual production. He's just a funder of trade and abstract assets. There's only exit to be exercised in increments that are sometimes fractions of a second. Now, of course, there's nothing natural here. This happens to be the structure that we've built up over the last, say, 40 years. And when we look at it critically, we say the outsourcing of the production of money has a particular goal, which is to divide decision-making power over the allocation of credit. Now, allocation of credit is just the impetus to exert human effort in socially productive ways. And the big question is whether this pyramid is actually likely to serve that vision, or is it much more likely to lead to fairly well-known divergences between motives of individual profit and social benefit. So, how much time do I have left?
Just a couple of minutes more.
Okay, so it may be obvious to many. I'll just telegraphically note that increasingly abstracted markets, that is, markets that are more distant from the actual production decisions, have increasingly obvious bad concrete effects. They undervalue infrastructure, and anything that's broadly conceived as subject to the problems of capturability of gains within the time horizon of finance just doesn't get, almost doesn't get financed at all. And that feeds the under-provision of public services, and that goes to the detriment of the widest swath of society. And these kinds of markets steamroll the process of growing inequality in multiple ways. Perhaps the worst is that they prop up stock values, financial asset prices generally, which feeds the really the smallest section of society, and it also takes salaries in that particular industry that skew the shape of employment towards the very top. They undermine some basic political processes. They shift resources from otherwise profitable but not necessarily high-yield endeavors that are likely to be more welfare enhancing. And the less concrete downsides are no less striking. So they undermine politics in a number of related ways, some of them tricky to perceive. One level is once that we see that the growing financial sector actually also means growing public debt. More of a national budget is typically then devoted to servicing the debt. The discretionary budget shrinks, and that means there's less to bargain over, feeding disillusionment with regular politics. This is one of those things that we might think would be less of a problem after we see the trillions that are easily trotted out to deal with the financial crisis or the coronavirus. But the idea of austerity still does a great deal of work in politics, especially outside the US. Deeper level of undermining politics is the shift away or the shrinking of the fields in which alternative measures of value are always on the table. So money is one way of valuing one way of valuing activity, but there are other, or profit is one way of valuing activity, and there's certainly other ways. The more the non-governmental or government supported but non-government directed credit system is, takes over, the less we can be conscious of the ways that other value systems actually should be dominant, at least in certain sections of our lives. And we tend to miss the point of what it means to deliberate about the meaning of living again. So this is the point where, if given time, I would try to connect the internal specialness of money. But when the state role as a funder is directly on the table, we're less likely to be confused about the kinds of value judgments involved in encouraging one kind of activity over another. The more abstract we make our money, the more we lose sight of the social relations that stand at the base of the money system. Is one system of valuation, that need not be taken for granted, or that need not be granted the kind of precedence and near exclusivity that it reaches when capitalism becomes so thoroughly financialized. The answer to this would be, rather than thinking about the safety and soundness of the banking system and the shadow banking system, what we should be really thinking about is just limiting their size and actually increasing the size of government-directed spending.
All right, thank you very much, Roy. So we've had two talks already, I think today, on the legal architecture of money and the way in which state power, allocates monetary resources and the ways that that's occluded from the view of observers outside the monetary system. So we'll change tack now, I think, a little bit as I turn it over to Suresh Naidu, who's going to, and then Tala Sai, to talk a little bit about the markets and power in the markets and things like that, and then we'll connect all these conversations together. So over to you, Suresh.
Can I use slides? I think I do not have hosting abilities.
You should be able to do it now.
Thank you. And there we go. Okay, so what I want to do is change the tone a bit and get into the and dive into the real, if you will. And so I want to sort of start out by just kind of like, I think, clearing up maybe, or like allowing for there to be the possibility of like a useful economics for the LPE agenda, and that it isn't, I feel like there's this unfortunate way in which like the economics is mediated by law and economics to the legal profession. And so all you get is like what comes through the law and economics wing of things. And that's just really not representative of most working economists. And so part of this is to like clarify what's actually behind the veil, and just to make it sort of somewhat relevant, I just want to sort of talk about ideas of power in economics and how there is like useful analytics and an actual toolkit for thinking systematically and empirically about what does it mean to have power. And I'm going to focus here on bilateral power exercised in private voluntary contracts. Which is sort of, the classic domain where philosophers and others have argued that there's no scope for power in bilateral exchange because everything's voluntary. And so I want to distinguish two types of power. One is market power, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it's just like your ability to like choose a price and still retain counterparties. So if you can set the price and not lose everyone, you've got a degree of market power, and it can come because you're either the only supplier of a given thing. It can come because like you're offering something that's actually, you can charge a lower price than anyone else. But it's basically that you can, you have this capacity to set prices and still retain counterparties. And importantly, this happens, it's plenty possible. In fact, like I would say benchmark models in economics have it that like, even with thick markets, with lots and lots of firms, with low concentration, it's still quite possible to have plenty of monopoly and monopsony, flip side in the labor market, particularly so long as like commodities are differentiated. So like think about like a house. It's like houses aren't perfect substitutes for each other. In the same way, jobs are not perfect substitutes for each other. This means whoever's like supplying a job has some idiosyncratic pricing power because substitutes for jobs are sparse and hard to come by. And then I want to talk about a perhaps lesser known form of power that I think Talha is going to also talk about, which is sort of short side power. It's not, I wouldn't say that that's like a popular term, but it's at least in the Palgrave. And I'm going to sort of define it as like the ability to costlessly deny a counterparty a rent. And so basically it's like, think about this, like I got to get a worker to come to work, fine, but then I need to actually get them to do something on the job that I can't monitor perfectly, and I can't necessarily police coercively, for example. And so what I need to do is actually make that worker afraid to get fired for shirking on the job. And in order to make them afraid, I need to pay them more than the value of being unemployed. Because otherwise, if they're just indifferent between working and being unemployed, then I have no credible threat. And so an important dimension about short side power is that you actually need to be giving workers like a rent in order to have power over them. And it's because you need to have the capacity to exercise a costly and credible threat. And so I want to come back to that if I have time about like how rents are not pejorative. It's like, you can't just say, oh, there's a rent and therefore it's like a bad thing. It's gotta be contextualized. And in my view, it's like both of these are present and pervasive in the labor market, which is kind of what I study most of the time. But it's also likely they're also kind of pervasive in other, let's call them Polanyian markets, like credit and housing and insurance and intellectual property, where like these kinds of endogenous contract enforcement and thin markets are just kind of all over the place. So just in the way of background, it's like not new in economics that market power is ubiquitous. It goes back to Adam Smith, who both recognized it, that collusion was kind of omnipresent in the background, and both on the product market side and on the labor market side. And this is back in a period when like basically feudal labor law was still in effect. So like, it was a crime to quit your job in most of in a lot of the labor market in this period. And contemporary business owners understand this. So like Peter Thiel, putting it in ingenious terms, is like competition is for losers. And Warren Buffett sort of highlighting the need for barriers to entry. So basically in the business school, you almost never would teach like perfect competition. You're teaching how to like set prices and how to pick price points and how to choose parts of the market to enter where you actually have some market power. And so, we can think of like a lot of what we're actually in the business of innovation is coming up with forms to like create and maintain market power. And there's some evidence, and I'm going to present some of it now on this, like on some of the data on like how, so in my view, there's just kind of like pervasive market power in some sectors. In other sectors, it actually takes some work and takes, and I think what we've kind of seen in some sectors is like just an increase in market power. So this is like, in economics, a somewhat famous graph, kind of computing markups in CompuStat from like 1950 on, and just kind of documenting this rise in markups. And so it's like really the case that like prices are much larger, much higher relative to marginal costs than they were. And this is happening at sort of the same time that like US investment is somewhat stagnating, and that there isn't, which is kind of consistent with how, we think about monopoly. It's like monopolists want to like constrain investment so that they can like ration a good and keep the price high. And so increasing markups is kind of consistent with lower investment. And, it's also consistent with there being a substantial, a pretty high profit rate. So this is like, the capital income divided by the capital stock. And this is the share of income going to corporate profits. And this is like an underestimate because tons of stuff is happening outside of the corporate sector that makes this look even worse. And then sort of putting these together, you're getting kind of this declining labor share of income, which is, subject of lots of debate and study. It turns out it's like, depending on what you look at, this is only there in the US. So like no other country has like a declining capital share, the declining labor share the way the US does. The other flip side of market power in the product market, which I think is something that's really the product market side of things, like IP and the rise of like big platforms, that's really a post-2000 phenomenon, and that's real. But I don't necessarily think it's the only. It's the biggest change I think in market power is kind of coming with is like since 2000 and before that since 1980. The thing that I think is actually like pervasive is just like there's just like a background level of monopsony in the labor market. And the way you should think about it is ask yourself the following thought experiment. If your employer cut your wages by 10%, what fraction of workers would you think leave? And so in perfect competition, it's like everybody instantaneously disappears from the workplace as soon as an employer slashes the wage. And when you actually like get inside and actually run that experiment, which we can do in certain places, you actually get estimates around 20 to 40%. So it's like, it's not the case that everyone's stuck at their job, but it's also not the case that the people are like footloose and fancy free and just shopping across employers. And this gives substantial scope for employers to have market power, because it means that you can lower the wage. You'll still keep plenty of workers. You might lose a few, but it's worth it to you because you keep overall payroll low. And just to show you some estimates of this quit elasticity, which is like how sensitive is quitting to wages across a bunch of groups. So you kind of have here, it's like the lower means the more responsive you are to quits. So like, you know, men are much more responsive to wages than other groups. Whites are more sensitive relative to African Americans and Hispanics, and you know, but importantly, urban and rural are not super different. So it's not the case that this is like something about thin labor markets with only a few employers. It's like even in cities, workers are not indifferent about which employer they're at. It's because you got to get to work. You have to get along with your boss. You have to like the job. It's like jobs are not perfectly substitutable for each other, even when there's lots of them. Okay, so that's it on market power. I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, but let me also talk about short side power, which is like kind of another which is the terms on what workers do inside the workplace. So what you want to think about this is like the experiment is if you randomly cut wages, what fraction get fired for low performance rather than what fraction voluntarily quit. And here it's harder to estimate this number for reasons we can talk about, but it's also maybe around 20%. And that applies again a substantial scope for short side power. Another piece of evidence for this kind of like labor discipline story is like a bunch of papers kind of showing that when you like increase when you lower the cost of workplace surveillance, this turns into like lower wages because you don't have to pay workers the higher wage in order to get them to do the work. And both of these things have this phenomenon of like kind of making the minimum wage. And I think this is a good note to talk about, because it's just like the minimum wage is a great evidence of like a price control, which are all sort of taught is like a bad idea and it's going to hurt the people that are rationed out of the labor market. And this is kind of like, I think the state of the art of the evidence on the minimum wage is kind of a graph like this that basically shows that all the wages, all the jobs, this is like the effect of the minimum wage across the whole wage distribution. And you see the yellow part is like all the jobs that are killed by the minimum wage, and the purple are all the jobs that show up after the minimum wage increases. And what you can sort of add up is like the purple mass just above the minimum wage like is equal to the yellow mass just below. So all the jobs that are getting killed by the minimum wage are like coming back at the minimum wage or higher. So that's why there's like not the employment trade-off. It's because like what's happening is that employers like have forced to raise their wage. And so yes, they're less likely to hire, but workers are less likely to quit, and chances are they're working a little bit harder. And so you both get these things that offset the higher costs of working. And that's why, there's not such a ferocious employment, any sort of like negative or very difficult to detect negative effect of the minimum wage on employment. Let me make this, I'll do one more slide after this. So I think this has a bunch of, to make this relevant for the audience, I think this has a number of like legal and normative implications. So one sort of quick immediate upshot of this idea of pervasive market power is that the law of one price fails, is that you immediately see that the same worker can get very different wages depending on which employer they're at. And this is something both classical economists and neoclassical economists have gotten wrong, is that like the idea that there's like, even Marx gets it wrong. He's like, there's one wage. That, you know, it's subsistence. And it's like, just not true. It's like the same worker can get very different wages depending on exactly which employer they're lucky enough to find. It also becomes that rents are pervasive and they're on both sides of the market. So both workers get rents and firms get rents, and you can't necessarily be pejorative about like, you know, rents are just all over the place. And I think this means that like arguments in Hale, which when you read it as an economist, you're like, wait, why is he never talking about competition? And so once you get in the background that like, oh, actually like market power is kind of ubiquitous in the background, a lot of like, at least to me, I feel like Hale's arguments actually finally register. For law, it also means that like the market prices are not necessarily good metrics of social value. So like these if you want to measure like the value of a statistical life or like the cost of regulations, just using the wages of workers doesn't measure that, because you're only picking up the you know, that idiosyncratic marginal worker, which is not representative of the average worker in any sense. And so like public tools to set prices become totally okay. Like we can make the case for even on straight neoclassical terms, efficiency improving, just like set the rate, and it can be helpful. I wanted to talk about political values can also show up in economic policy, not just redistribution. So we can talk about things like domination and democracy in the economy, and don't just have to like talk about redistribution as the thing that we care about inside the economy. And I do want to highlight though that like it means that enforcement becomes the big constraint, which does depend on technology and organization. And so like you can do a lot of things with law, but ultimately enforcement kind of really is like a binding constraint on, you can pass a law, but can you enforce it? And a lot of stuff in the labor market is really like hemmed in by the inability and the high costs of enforcing a lot of labor law. And okay, sorry, I'm probably over time. This will be my last slide. So I just also wanted to start a fight and talk about just like the limits of a purely money focused view on what the economy is. And it's the oldest debate. I mean, like the Grundrisse opens up with like him taking on Derrymon and this like free credit idea in like the 19th century. And so the exchange versus production based intra-left conflict, I think, is like ancient and will probably not get resolved today. But I just want to like highlight it, that when you have this domain of like private power over wage and price setting, if you just kind of think of your only tools as the fiscal system and the financial system, you're still leaving the price and wage setting to privately held firms controlled by owners. And so that means that inflation winds up being a constraint because they'll set prices. And you can say, okay, well, we'll control prices, but then production still gets controlled privately, and that can turn into shortages. And so then you have to go into like controlling production, and then you wind up into, again, real constraints on the legitimacy and administrative capacity of the state, which I think relates to Paula's talk about Chile. And so I just think it's like important to keep this like focus on the actual nuts and bolts of real power in the economy, which happen in markets, in contracts, in the actual process of production, rather than at least only looking at the accounting sphere as like the domain in which redistribution happens. And I'll stop there.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Suresh. And I think this will segue very nicely, I think, into Tala's talk. So Tala, over to you for 12 minutes. Sorry, you're on mute.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Sonoy. Thanks. I think it's a pretty clean segue, because I want to talk not about money or power, but markets, right? The third in the title. Basically, my fundamental focus here is on the difference between a focus on power within markets versus a focus on the structure of generalized markets per se. And so it's a sort of nice contrast with what Suresh has just been talking about. I want to develop a perspective that I think is fundamentally distinct, but complementary to the one that he, I think, quite perfectly articulated here. And I don't think I'll have time, but if I do, I'd love to touch on how this relates to the legal construction of money that Paula and Roy were talking about, but if not, hopefully it can come up in discussion. So again, my sort of central focus here is on the difference between a frame that looks at power within markets versus one that just looks at the structure of generalized markets themselves. So the sort of fundamental contrast here can just be summarized as Hale versus Polanyi. In my view, they're very, very different. Hale's driving focus is on what I'll call sort of asymmetries within markets or asymmetrical markets, vertical relations of power within markets. But Polanyi's focus, I want to argue, building on Marx, is very different. It's on generalized markets themselves, not asymmetrical markets, but just generalizing markets. And I think that's a very different analysis. And I think the two are complementary again, but they're distinct. And so within political economy, critical political economy, classical political economy, the sort of central thread of the debate can be critics, seen as critics who focus on vertical relations of power, and sort of mainstream defenders who keep pointing to horizontal relations of competition, right? So this goes right back to Smith. On the one hand, Adam Smith is focusing on vertical relations rooted in the state to attack mercantilism and contrast that with the horizontal relations of free trade. Similarly, he talks about, as Suresh put on already, the vertical relations of monopoly that can get either through collusion or through, the waterfall on a hill against the virtues of horizontal competition. Then Ricardo picks this up, goes from, Smith's two verticals are state and monopoly. Ricardo adds a third, property. He attacks the property-based rents of the idle gentry and argues that free trade can usurp and take those away, putting them to productive use, right? So property-based rents. And that property analytic is then understood, in my view, somewhat problematically, to just be taken over by Marx, who generalizes it into a class-based analysis of the vertical. So now we don't just have the state, we don't just have monopoly, we don't just have property, now we've got class as a new vertical relation, and Marx is thought to overtake Ricardo's analysis and generalize it to train his guns not on the idle gentry in the countryside, but the capitalists themselves as the employing class, and generalizing the Ricardian analysis. And so then the story goes forward. Hale is notoriously developing a neo-Ricardian analytic of property rights, but now showing that it's not just one decision, but 1,000 decisions. It's piecemeal throughout the legal system. It's, again, the focus on state-backed property rights as a source of coercion and bargaining power and the maldistribution of surplus or rents. And then critical race and feminist scholars pick it up and add racialized and gendered power relations as a further set of vertical relations. The response, of course, from the mainstream is always the same. Markets, when working properly, should have a leveling or horizontal effect through competition, right? So Smith himself has that. His cure for his vertical is always more horizontal competition. Ricardo's cure for the vertical is more horizontal competition. We generalize that. Coase's response to a Hale analysis is, well, look, as long as markets are working relatively low transaction cost wise, many of these isolated pockets will sooner or later be overcome by the dam of the market forces. Similarly, Paul Samuelson notoriously said, in a competitive equilibrium economy, it doesn't matter if labor hires capital, or capital hires labor, or labor hires capital, it's all the same. Of course, it's exactly a response to that sort of analytic that all the analytics Suresh put on the table, that Bowles and Gintis and others have developed about short side power and the pervasiveness of market power are a response. And so, but that's the whole debate, right? Vertical, horizontal, vertical, horizontal. And I think that's a powerful and important debate, but I think it's also a debate that can cramp and limit our understanding and our program. Take an example within IP. I was within the sort of vertical Ricardian IP camp for a long time, trying to show the pervasive prevalence of patent rents over and above what you would need for R&D. But of course, the mainstream response is always, well, listen, if pharma is really enjoying these rents for that long, there's going to be more upstream competition for R&D, and that will overturn the rents. There'll be more entrants. How do you know what the right level of R&D competition is, right? There's always a horizontal response to the vertical argument. And Suresh, I think, really quite brilliantly laid out the sort of terrain and showing that, in fact, the complacency of the horizontal view is not really deserved, and that's great. But I still think there are limits to this sort of frame. And the limits I'm just going to illustrate with IP and antitrust briefly. You know, within IP, fundamentally, as important as the concern with the monopoly power and rents of patents is in fact rent dissipation, is in fact the amount of anarchic competition which results in massive waste of duplicative R&D in pharma. Roughly half of all of pharma R&D is plausibly a waste as a result of market competition for the rents. There might not be any rents at the end of the road, but there's a lot of waste. And to address that, we need to do more than just say, well, monopoly, troubling, let's have more competition, more of the Schumpeterian destructive gales against the sort of inlets of power, because that sort of back and forth is pretty limited in its purview. I mean, fundamentally what we want to do, I think, in say IP in pharma is have more publicly funded and coordinated R&D that also has the market at work, but also reduces rents and also improves access and lowers prices without just relying on whether it's more or less patents. We have to have, you know, alternatives. Similarly with antitrust, of course, market power of big tech is a concern, but so is just the basic business model of data-based business. And that's going to be a concern even if there's 10 Facebooks. The general model is itself a concern. And that analytic of the general model that's forced upon everyone in a generalized market setting is, I think, most powerfully developed by Marx and Polanyi. And I want to say a few words about the explanatory frame that Marx develops, and from it, the programmatic frame that I think comes out from a Polanyian perspective. So the fundamental point is that Marx's analysis is not really about class power, nor about markets simplicity. His entire point is that capitalism is a kind of historically specific coupling of the vertical and horizontal that's never been seen before. I mean, the entire point is we've had class societies with vertical relations, but the dominant classes weren't subject to market competition. And his point isn't that market competition is somehow illusory. It's real, it's fundamental, it drives the whole system. His whole point is that capitalism is a system of generalized markets. Everyone is subject to the imperatives of markets. Everyone is subject to the logic of compete or die, reinvest or die, expand or die, innovate or die, grow or die. It's pervasive. And how does that happen? By separating all economic agents from non-market access to the means of life to social production. The more you generalize markets, the more you expand their imperatives, the more markets become a realm of imperatives rather than real opportunities. Fundamentally, the amount of freedom any agent has in a market is just a function of how free they are out to be from the market. It's freedom from the market that gives you freedom inside the market. You have to contract generalized markets. You have to give people genuine non-market decommodified access to fundamental goods and fundamental alternative forms of social relations of production if you want to reduce the imperative forces of markets and increase their opportunity aspects. So none of this is a response against markets, but it's about focusing on generalized markets as themselves part of the problem. And that's, of course, Polanyi's entire analysis. Polanyi's analysis is about when markets get disembedded and out of social control. And by that, he means they get disembedded from decommodified social relations. So the sort of legal realist reading of Polanyi, oh yeah, Polanyi's pointing out that markets are always already embedded in law, is, I believe, just unhelpful and wrong. I mean, of course, everything's always already embedded in law. Big deal. The main point is, what sorts of social relations are they going to be embedded in? And, you know, we have to have an analytic of different kinds of social relations in which you can embed things. Polanyi's point isn't that markets got disembedded from social relations. Markets just are a social relation. They're a social relation in which people relate to each other as exchange economic agents constituted by legal and social relations. His whole point is that there's other ways of shaping social relations. And if you don't have non-market social relations embedding the market ones, you get generalized, or as Roy's putting out, increasingly abstracted social relations. And those are the disembedment process that Polanyi's talking about. So it just doesn't do to do the legal realist move of just saying, oh yeah, everything is always legally constructed. Well, no, everything may be legally constructed, but the point is how things are constructed. And there's a market or commodifying form of social construction, and there's decommodified forms of social construction, and erasing that distinction by just going on about legal constitution and legal construction is, I think, pretty unhelpful. We need to retain the analytic between different modes of social relations and how they're constructed and deconstructed. How much time do I have, Sanoy?
About 1.5 minutes.
Well, okay, great. So obviously that's all very abstract. So I just want to give a couple of small examples. One, in education, two in areas that I work in. One is education. The entire debate in education is about what type of equality of opportunity for what types of barriers to a truly opportunity system in education. But the premise of that whole debate is how to remove all the barriers to a truly fair competition for competitive success in K-12, a truly fair form of meritocracy. That's just the premise of every participant in the debate. Every participant in the debate has adopted a commodified notion of primary education. But if you have the view that primary education is formative, developmental, about citizens and persons, not about market agents, then you can't just focus on, as a matter of equity, how to make sure those who have merit have that merit shine through. It's a different focus entirely. It's about formative development. What's equitable access to everyone as a matter of formative development? That seemingly small shift in frame results in a totally different normative orientation, a totally different orientation towards allocation of school resources, a totally different orientation about who has special needs and who doesn't with respect to what types of claims. And similarly, in the context of health, the fundamental idea in health equity can't just be, well, making sure that the insurance market doesn't morally select against those with high risk, but makes the risk pools work. Well, no, any market for risk pools will inevitably, if it's working well, squeeze out those with pre-existing conditions. That's the point of a market. So if you want to have access to healthcare, we basically have to decommodify our conception of health as a good and understand that this is not a case where it's just about market failures, but it's just not a case where markets make sense. Okay, I'll stop.
Wow, that was wonderful. All right, so we're really keeping good time over here, and I want to turn very quickly to audience questions. How about we do about 7 to 8 minutes of questions amongst panelists for each other, and I'll ask one question at the end of that to everybody to get us started, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question for each other right now, this is a good time to ask it, and then I will take some prerogative and ask one of my own. Go ahead, Krish.
Okay, so my question is for Taha, which is, I think you want to draw a line between commodification and competition. There are plenty of forms of competition that are non-commodified. I think of the LSAT. And there are ways of embedding competition in non-market frames, and the competition might institutionalize a normative value that you like or dislike, but that is separate from the question of commodification in markets.
I agree. Totally well taken. I want to delink, but I also want to delink my argument of decommodification from anti-commodification. So there's two delinks. I think Shirish is exactly correct. There can be non-commodified forms of competition, and then we have to evaluate what we think of that generally. And I'm not at all poo-pooing that. But there's also can be decommodification that isn't motivated by anti-commodification. It's not markets are icky. It's that generalized markets are a domain of imperatives and which generate necessarily differentials and inequalities between people and in their freedom, but also are a form of social domination, an impersonal form of social domination in which none of us are able to exercise democratic agency. Those are my problems with generalized markets, right? This isn't the sort of Michael Sandel markets are icky thing. It's about decommodification, not anti-commodification. So I'm totally with you, sir, is that one can delink commodification and competition, but I also want to delink anti-commodification from decommodification.
Wow, that's great.
So,
Wanna
okay,
comment? No, go ahead.
I'm just like, look, there's plenty of other large scale systems of social domination that are not the market. And like the state. And so I think like whatever the standards of like an impersonal form of rule, you know, I completely agree on the market being like an impersonal form of domination, but we should like, there's also not, I just want to get clear what is the economic part of this and what is just like a generic criticism of all forms of abstract institutions that impose wills on people that are not their own.
No, it's very simple. It's that the state is at least formally targeted and understood as a site of political agency, but the out of control forces of ceaseless growth and eco-crisis are often attributed to something like Anthropocene or humans or consumption or demography or geography. And my point is, no, it's capitalism. It's that simple. We have to name and articulate that it's an out of control system of ceaseless growth, which is driven by an institutionalization of a competitive logic, which requires ceaseless reaccumulation, as Paulo was putting it, a regime of accumulation, and that has to be a socio-political subject of democratic address. None of this is against markets, but it's about markets that have to be harnessed and put in their place. Right now, they're not. We're, in Polanyi's terms, not in a market economy. We're in a market society. The society is driven by a disembedded market, which is driving the show through logics, which are impersonal and not just personal and not just power, but the coupling of vertical and horizontal. That's what I want to put on the table. I want to put on the table a fundamental Marxian Polanyian theme, which is that we cannot limit the sites of democratic agency and politics to power within markets, but the structural features which generate market logics as outside of even social political control.
All right, Paula.
Thank you, Sonoy. Well, this is very interesting. I have learned also a lot from hearing from you. I have some commentaries, really. It's what Talia is saying and about competition and market. Also, it reminded me of Schumpeter's like analysis that you require monopoly also to produce investment. So that was like one of the sides because he makes a distinction, and I think also in economics it's done about short-term decisions and long-term decisions, and that was one of the points I think that you can argue with Polanyi, with Schumpeter, that sometimes state monopoly can be can produce, I think, wealth. And this was, I think, the case in the Allende's government, and that was one of the points that was challenged its policy because it was deemed to go against antitrust. Because there's also the idea that the state or that the state enterprises are, or state companies are the same as private companies. So that I think you have to separate or like study more how to understand monopoly structures when the monopoly is owned by the state, something like that. The other thing is, I have a comment on Suresh. I don't know if he has taken into account, like when analyzing the market, the wages and the labor markets, the underlying structure, like providing, for instance, social rights, because when you have social rights in place in certain societies, I mean, that could, I think, be something to take in mind when deciding when your wage is reduced, whether you exit or not the market. Thank you.
All right. So those are wonderful two comments. And I might invite Suresh and Tala to say something about that right away. But I was also wanted to check if Roy had something to say. And then we'll take one final round of sort of quick 10 seconds from everybody before I turn to the audience.
Okay.
All right. So quick quick responses from first Suresh and then Tala, and then I'll turn to the audience and I'll ask my question at the end.
So, Paula, just so perfectly bang on. I completely agree. I mean, the whole point, of course, the Schumpeterian analysis was mobilized in the 60s and 70s as neoliberal skepticism towards antitrust, that, hey, you need integrated economies of scale and scope, and they are the result of a competitive process. Don't punish the winner of a competitive process. And so it was done to kind of shield antitrust scrutiny for bigness. But of course, the point is, in pharma at least, lots of the economies of scale and scope of R&D are and can be realized by either public institutions or regulated private ones. And that whole mode of thinking requires us breaking out of the antitrust box of, well, either the size is big and anti-competitive, and therefore we must break it up, or not, right? So what you're saying is exactly right. If you have a more of a regulated utility, a public utility model, you're going to have to break out of the antitrust frame and understand that we're now going to have different ways of having both the benefits of large integrated economies of scale, scope, network effects, but also realize that, of course, with that comes real threats, and those have to be somehow managed, whether they're regulated or through a public model. I mean, are things that we have to work on. And I mean, in the pharma context, I think it has to be a mix of both and market actors. So I think it's terrific.
I'll just answer so we're particularly looking at like voluntary quits, and so that's it does account for, you know, you're obviously, it's easier for you to voluntarily quit when you have some sort of safety net, and so the definitions we're looking at here is like a voluntary quit when you're asked, like, did you voluntarily quit? And so that's kind of like my preferred measure of like how much like real freedom kind of exists in the labor market. It's like, if you can walk away from your job, then that's like a restricted scope for domination there. And so, yeah.
All right, wonderful. So what we'll do now is turn to audience questions, because I'd like to get everybody in from the audience first. So I'll start with a question from Amy Kapczynski. This question has resonance to the conversation that Suresh and Tala were already having. But the question goes something like this, that Tala's question implies a skepticism about competition itself, sometimes as a cost rather than a technique for driving the efficient allocation of resources. I'm curious how the other panelists think about this, which is Suresh's view. For example, or think about this, Suresh's view seems incompatible with skepticism of the value of competition. So we'd love to hear the two of you talk about what we want to take out of competition and what that implies for Ren's market power conversation that Suresh introduced. So we can all turn to the Q&A screen, and you will find the questions listed over there. Since we already had Suresh and Tala talk about this, how about I offer the other panelists a quick chance to reflect on that chat about competition a little bit, and then maybe turn it back to Suresh and Tala.
Sorry, who's supposed to be talking? Oh, right, good.
Yeah, I didn't get the last bit back. Who's supposed to be talking?
So I think Roy, you and Paula are up.
So I wanted to give the others a chance to talk about that conversation before I come back to Suresh and Tala. So Roy, if you want to go first.
So this is, I think there are a couple of important things. One is that there are many ways to run competition, and the particular kind of market competition that we're used to is really about, it's just about competition for profits. And I don't think that, so, you know, we can run competitions in many other ways. I don't think there's necessary, I don't think, so Tala's written about this, right? If we could have a competitive system for pharmaceutical production that is not the patent system. Or we could have a prize system. There are lots of different ways to run competitions. the view from the United States is a little bit weird. That basically the only country where health is run almost exclusively as a profits competition. It just seems not civilized from the rest of the world. Rest of the world, looking at the United States. So there are easy things. Which are the things that I would take out of competition for profits? For me, it's easy. I would take most of education out and most of health out, and then I would take out a lot of other things as well, but they would be, I think, more controversial. It's easy. I think it's easy to take, the things that in most of the world we think of as citizenship goods. It's easy to think of taking those out of competition. Only in the United States is it difficult to think of taking those things out of competition for profit. And I think one way of doing that is really shifting the places where government decides to spend, and that goes back to what I was saying about shifting the relative size of the different modes of funding that we do.
Go ahead.
Paula or me?
Yeah, Tyler, go ahead.
Sure. No, so Amy, that's really wonderful. Thanks. And so I want to agree with Roy, but also draw an important point of distinction, because I think, Amy, I think you understand me well here, which is, in fact, I'm saying something beyond just sort of price-based competition for drugs. I am talking about other because that's still a profit-based model, right? Roy was saying, but it's profit-based. A price-based model is just a market-based model without patents. But it's still profit-based. Roy, go ahead.
So it is and it isn't. There's the actors who are developing on profit decisions about where to look for.
Got it.
And that's important.
Perfect. I agree. That's fundamental. So I'll pick up on that's terrific. Yeah, you can have the prize is set not by profit but by social judgment of value. Sorry, Roy. Absolutely correct. But I want to go further. I want to go further in the way Amy has nicely intuited, which is the following. I think there's a conflation between competition and decentralization. Of course, I think decentralization is fundamental in organizing for the reasons that Paula gave from Hayek, even if she didn't mean to fully endorse them. Yeah, the catalytic ideas. But hey, in basic research, we have a very robust decentralized system of search and discovery and informational possibility frontier innovation, which isn't based on competition in a market form at all. It's based on a decommodified form of peer production called academics. Academic science, you can call that competition, and that's fine. But the point is peer production based on priority credit, based on publish or perish, based on vigilant review of each other, is searching by the lamppost of what we already know to extend it, rather than looking to solve practical problems where they exist. There's this basic division of labor that happens, and peer production in the upstream basic research zone is decentralized. I don't care if you call it competition or not, but it ain't the market. And similarly, I think with education, the other example Roy gave, I don't think K-12 should be organized around the model of a competition for grades, period. I think the competition for grades model is clearly gravitationally pulled by a market model, which is, well, we need the grades as the markers, so university, and we need that as credentialing for the labor market. But the fundamental point is, I think K-12 education should be organized on a decentralized model of development, on the idea that everyone's development as a person and as a citizen is a fundamental commitment of a democratic society. Formative development is our aim. We can use grades, but they're not the criteria of educational allocation or resources. And that's a fundamentally different model. So I'm basically saying, yeah, I think competition or market competition has its place. I think market embedded, socially valued competition a la prize system has its place, what Roy is putting on the table, constructing the competition differently. And I also think decentralized forms of non-market competition need to be given a fuller hearing. The work of Yochai Benkler and others on commons production, which I'm drawing on here to talk about peer production in a publicly funded model. I mean, that's the sort of lens I want to put on. I want to push against, again, a kind of legal realist view. Well, competition can mean whatever you want, so of course there's no point in critiquing competition, let's just work within it. Well, no, there are different things. There's market competition, there's socially embedded and differently priced competition, and there's non-market decentralized competition. And I think those differences matter conceptually, institutionally, normatively.
All right, wonderful. We're sort of pushing the end of time, so I'd like to get a few more questions in. So I'd request the panelists to have sort of short answers now onwards. I'm going to do a little bit of picking over here, and I'm going to obviously ask some of the other questions as well. But let me pick Adam's question over here, which is for Paula, which is that most advanced economies have seen prolonged periods of low inflation, whether or not due to central bank activity. Does this empirical trend support or call into question the received wisdom of strict central bank independence? So this is a great question.
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you also, Adam, for the question. I find fascinating, especially like the link between low inflation and central bank independence. And this is being discussed currently in our country. It's a very hot issue because we have the central bank is independent and is embedded in the constitution, and it is supposedly helped to change the very the problem of inflation that we also had during the whole 20th century, and they linked it to the central bank's independence. And that's why I also like to analyze the monetarism and structuralism, that both trends, economic trends, have a different idea of what inflation is. One points out through the idea of the commodity form of money that you only have to control the demand and the supply, and especially independence from the government helps to protect the issuing of money from like populist political representatives. That's the narrative, you know. But if inflation is only strictly a monetary phenomenon, rather the structuralist tradition would say that inflation, yes, it's like sometimes a disease for the economy, but it's linked towards like the labor and the productive economy that generates these higher prices. So in short, yes, this trend of course pushes us in general to I think to endorse the central bank's independence. I don't think that's correct. And in particularly looking to the Chilean case, the biggest fall of inflation took place when central bank was completely state controlled by the dictatorship. Thank you.
Wow. All right, wonderful. Okay, next question. And this one picks off of a line that I think Tahla used in response to Suresh's question, which is, what is the difference between decommodification and anti-commodification? I'm throwing the question open for the panel, so whoever wants to go first will just unmute themselves and start talking, or otherwise it's too tough.
Should I go? Sorry, of course, I don't mean any sort of technical or now we can investigate some sort of, all I mean a deep difference. What I mean is really the following. There's an anti-commodification line of literature starting from Peggy Radin's great work, and then other people's maybe not so great work, and then Michael Sandel. And that whole literature is very individualistic. It's about banning individuals from engaging in certain market exchanges because markets are icky for some reason. They express various problematic reductions of various non-market values into market values. There's non-fungibility and so forth. And that argument is always easily critiqued as, well, all you're doing is restricting people who are in disadvantaged circumstances from an option of voluntary trade, which seems to make them worse off. And it's kind of not really clear what their point is. And I'm not really into the anti-commodification thing. I'm into, no, from a structural point of view, socially embedding and removing certain goods from purely market or commodity logics can have really important power and developmental improvements for people's lives. Health. My point is, health has to be understood, as Roy was saying, very much as ill-fitting a market, either in its production or its in consumption. But even if its production is a market, its consumption doesn't make sense as a commodity in its basic form. The health insurance market can't be fixed. It's not about market insurance concentration. It's about the fact that insurance of a private sort or employment-based makes no sense as a general model for providing people access to health. Why? Because health is, we understand, to be such a fundamental good that most of us are uncomfortable letting people who are high risk or low income not have access to it. And therefore, that commitment of social solidarity has to be expressed institutionally in a way that takes it off the market. Similarly with education. I don't think it makes any sense to understand primary education on a market model. I just think that makes no sense. It basically makes the view that all our kids should just be understood as right from the get-go, on the race, fire your engines, make sure those people with the natural engines can rev highest, are given the best, smoothest road, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that makes sense. And it's not about, icky markets, let's not do that. It's about certain ways of organizing certain goods, certain activities on a logic of profit maximization and commodity-based competition don't make sense, I think. And I think in general, for labor, to pick up a Suresh thing, having a decommodified attitude towards labor outside the market can improve bargaining power within the market of the sort that Suresh is talking about, right? Having a federal jobs guarantee, having a more generous social security state will provide labor, exactly as Suresh is saying, non-market, non-employment alternatives, which increase their bargaining power in the labor market setting. That's another form of decommodification, which is about structurally redistributing by reshaping the power relations of the market, by reshaping the market, by contracting it. That's what I mean.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. And I should have recognized that that question came from Athena Mutua. So I just wanted to quickly check with Raul, Corinne, and Jay that we can go on for about 5 to 6 more minutes, given when we started.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, good. All right, so the next question is from Oren. And the question is, what is entailed by a shift of emphasis from the vertical, which is Hale, to horizontal and vertical integrated, which is Marx and Polanyi, for 2 specific areas of money and labor? What do we get to see better following the adjustment of this lens, both diagnostically and prescriptively? I think the question was addressed to Tala, but also to everybody else. And since I was wondering if Roy would like to speak a little bit about money and this lens shift, and then maybe we can turn to some other.
Roy? I don't think Roy heard.
No, I'm trying to reread the question because
Sorry, Roy.
So I think about the frame of vertical and horizontal.
I mean, if I can ask you, Roy,
Yeah.
Is the focus, I hear your focus to be as much about, and you said it, about reducing the abstraction of the financial market, is as much or more about embedding it within socio-political purposes rather than just allowing sort of, M prime logics of expanding circuits of exchange, then it is about directly attacking the power of any concentrated finance. Did I misunderstand you? Like, the focus is as much about socially embedding finance as it is about attacking some vertical power relationship of concentrated finance.
It is. So let me give you one take on this. I'm not sure that it's exactly the same view of the. So when people talk about, let's say, what shadow banks are doing, and shadow banks are doing transactions with, none of us will ever transact with a shadow bank in its capacity as a shadow bank. Right? So, they're doing business basically with each other. Now, some people say, okay, this is completing the market, right? It's actually making the horizontal relationships of the market more and more sophisticated. It's actually allowing it's actually allowing firms to divide risks in an even finer, more granular fashion, and somehow there are efficiencies there and so on. Right? It's this idea that more and more horizontal interactions or transactions always produce a benefit. Now, obviously, somebody is making a benefit there. Perhaps just the people who are writing up the transactions, right? There are certain kinds of rents, but the idea that those flow to the right places, and this gets back to the social the social purposes, right? The idea that those get to the right places is, let's say it's counterintuitive, and it doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence right now. I think there's pretty good, not necessarily completely rigorous evidence that the money invested and made in those places not actually going to places where we think it would do the most good socially. So if that's that's the answer to. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, my problem isn't with the question of how much power Morgan Stanley has.
Right.
It's a question of what are we trying to do when we build a system?
That's exactly it. I mean, you said it. It's the multiplication of the horizontal relations. In fact, the generalization of the financial market, it's increasing abstraction from real production that is the target of your focus. And not the fact that, of course, there's going to be some people who win more than lose some in the casino that's going on there. But the fundamental social question is how to re-embed this thing and make it more socially responsive. And so the point isn't, well, let's have more competition. No, in fact, the market may be competitive. It's just that this market logic is out of social control. I mean, that's how I urge it. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're really almost at the end of time over here. It's the 11th hour. So I have one more question in the chat, and then I had a quick one of my own. So maybe I'll ask one quick question and see everybody give like 15-second quick answers to this one, which is, something that's connecting the two large sets of conversations that we have had today. So let me ask a question about fetish. So money emerges under capitalism as the fetish par excellence, and from Suresh and Tala's talk, we see that there may be a way to work on the fetishism of commodities within capitalism, but that commodity relations will always mask some underlying social relations. So the question is, when we fix the monetary architecture in the ways, or sort of move towards some ways of a better monetary architecture, do we escape this fundamental problem of fetishism hiding social relations, which may be social relations of domination or all other kinds of power? So let me leave that question as a joining question for everybody and take quick answers from everyone. So let me start with Suresh, then we'll come to Paula, Roy, and then Tala.
I mean, on one hand, I mean, this sort of comes back to Tala's. It's like, Marx is about the horizontal, but then he talks a lot about the labor market, and it's like goes immediately into the hidden abode and kind of builds it up all out of there. So I kind of like disagree with the sort of underlying architecture, and I get my other sort of disagreement is that look, any complex system of social provision is going to have relationships that are obscured to any individual. There's just no other way to implement a division of labor among billions of people that's producing ridiculously complicated products without obscuring some of the social relations that go into that production process. And money does it one way, so planning would do it another, an algorithm does it another way. It's like but at some level, some deliberate obfuscation of the underlying social reality is necessary to do that, to implement that division of labor.
Amazing. Paula.
Oh, Sanoy, I think your question is very challenging. But in any case, I agree what Suresh said, and also Talia has mentioned about that. Of course, there is always some legal structure, and that the law is everything like is legally constructed, something like that. But I don't. But and in a way, like very somehow a little bit dismissive on the realist. I know that's a very quick way of putting it, but I get the point of trying to or continuing the I think the purpose of understanding how really like or where the law locates or distributes power, understanding that it always probably will do so because that's what law is a representation of political possibilities institutionally, and so it will depend on how I think in the end how the political system works.
Okay. So in some ways, I think I basically disagree with Suresh on the question of obfuscation. I think the most interesting, one of the most interesting things about capitalism is that the obfuscation or the veiling of how things work is fundamental, and that is not absolutely necessary for any system, in the sense that the sense of necessity regarding how things work is just, I think, much the sense of necessity as an external force, as something that no one is in control of, is I think incredibly strong in capitalism, and in a way in planning is never there. It's all you always have. You always have someone to blame. This is it's the difference between working in a law faculty. There's a dean who planned something. You do have someone to blame. It's maybe not a large enough bureaucratic organization, but in a planned organization, that I think there's something about the social relation that's not obscured, certainly not as obscured, or not as successfully obscured as the way it is in capitalism. And I think that is something that, regarding which there's a lot of plasticity. And one of the things that we can do by showing how certain mechanisms work is to relieve that sense of necessity, and to sort of revitalize some of the political energy that can go into changing.
Yeah, Tala, you have the last word.
So I need to first just say, of course, Marx talks about the hidden abode and production, but the whole point is he starts with the commodity form, because the vertical is produced by the horizontal in a generalized setting. It's not like Marx is talking about the horizontal and not the vertical. He's talking about their coupling. That's the whole point. The whole point is how they generate each other. But on the fetishism point, yeah, I don't think it's about having fully transparent social relations. I think that's a kind of Hegelian misguided idea. The point is to build on what Roy and Paula are saying, is about the fact that the fetishism of commodities means what? It means that social relations of production are not hidden behind a veil through the market and thereby seem as if they're natural and individualized. That's the fetishism of commodities. It naturalizes and individualizes what are historically specific social relations. And the point of the fetishism critique is to put historically specific social relations as social relations up for political contest. And that is the fundamental point of Marx. And I also want to say that the realism's relationship to that is double-faced. In one, it's a recovery of that insight and a pushing forward of it. But in another, it loses part of the insight because it insists all the social relations must be understood through state action. But no, you can analyze social relations not just through the lens of the law and state action. And you have to have all the social relations on the table for political contest. So I think realism both is an advance and the realist analysis on that front. But thanks for that very esoteric and lovely question, Sonoy.
All right. Well, I think I might want to close here. There's one question. I was wondering if people have time for maybe one more question, or I don't want to make it seem like I'm detaining people now. It's really a little bit beyond time, but I don't know if there's maybe quick short answers to a policy directed question at the end. This is from an anonymous attendee. But let's just go to the last part of the question, which is, has the ability of a democratic government to control growth in the economy been largely eliminated? All right, very short answers, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay, I'll just say one thing. I think that question exactly nails the problem. I mean, the whole point of having an out of control social logic, which is veiled behind a naturalized form, is to make the democratic control of ceaseless growth more and more difficult, both ideologically and now institutionally, as neoliberal attacks on sovereignty have become institutionalized in global finance.
Yeah, my short answer would just be no. Governments can actually do a lot to change the way growth works, and part of that would be to actually shift resources into things that are welfare enhancing. That maybe you might have to measure growth completely differently, but you could. I think governments still have lots of power to make huge upturns in the amount of social value generated in
for me, I think it depends. It depends where are you, from where are you responding the question, and to distinguish like economic growth from development. And I think that there are two separate ideas. I would like to answer that the state can, or political authority, I mean, can reassess or reapprehend like the power to guide economic production towards development and not only growth.
I mean, I think if you can get the political coalition together, you could do it. But I'm more skeptical about the underlying democracy part of it than anything about the capacity part of it.
All right. Well, on that note, I think let me take the chance to say thank you to everyone for turning up today, to the panelists for speaking, for everybody else for great questions, and for listening in. This has been, part of a great series by the LPE project. So thank you, everyone, and we'll call it a day. So have a nice day wherever you are, or good night.
Thanks, Sonoy. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, LPE. Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, Raul.
Bye.